that I bet many of us never even thought about before. All right, so who the heck is this guy? Past member Jerry Van Weingarten holds a BA from Calvin College, an MA from the University of Minnesota in geography, an MA from the University of Michigan in education, and a certificate as a specialist in administration from Michigan State University. He has been a K-12 teacher, the superintendent of Hamilton Community Schools, and a part-time geography instructor at Hope College, Muskegon Community College, Davenport University, Grand Valley State University, and Calvin College. I'm sorry we have such an unqualified presenter. We'll just have to put up with it.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah. Okay.
Go for it, Jerry.
All right. Thank you, Bruce. And you already mentioned, I'm sure at this point, as you will see on the on your screen, that Teresa Ellis was going to do the coordinating. And of course, her husband just died this past week. And so Bruce is taking over. So thank you, Bruce. All right. We got our signals changed. Had a little bit of a problem with our schedule here a little bit this morning. At least we're ready to go, I do believe. Now, if you wish to interrupt, by all means do so with questions or comments as we go along. I'll see if I can get this thing started now. Okay. So you have with you a quiz. By the way, the quiz, whatever you want to do with it. There are two of them. We go halfway and then we get the first one done and then you go to the second one. So it's supposed to follow somewhat what the presentation does. And so you can kind of fill in as you go. If you were in the classroom, well, then you were supposed to visit with your neighbor to see which ones were the correct answers. But since you are by yourself, why just go ahead and guess and we'll give you the answers eventually. Well, as you can see, we've got quite a picture of rivers here. And I'll go on to the next one, 2 or 3 here to give you some more examples of this. You may have downloaded this one. And if you did, you'll get a little idea where we are talking about the Appalachian Mountains here for one thing. When we talk about the fall line cities, and they're all up against the Appalachian Mountains. So we'll see that in just a moment. So it's just the eastern part this time. I think we will be able to cover it all. I've got maybe too many slides, but we'll see how that goes. Also, you should have this one, at least you can zero in on some of the rivers. Not every one is in here. So you can see the ones at least that we're going to work on. The big one, of course, is the Mississippi. There's something called a fall line, and I'm sure you know about that. And it goes about into here, and many of the cities in the East Coast are along that fall line because obviously they couldn't get their sailing vessels earlier on anyway, or any others beyond the fall, up to the fall line. And so they established their cities there. And as you can see, there's a whole long list of them along here. Now, when they did that, they established not only the city, but many of them use that fall line for power, water power, and they built their large factory buildings. I think many of those are still there, except not used as a factory. They're there to be used as maybe converted into a mall or into apartments or whatever. But they're big buildings that are located nearby where they could use the water at one time. You will notice a small map here. I will bring this up again later on when I talk about the crystalline Appalachians. So, but here you have an idea where all these are. Now, a few pictures of that. Obviously, you can see why they couldn't go up any further on the fall line with their ships. Here's Baltimore, the Delaware River at that fall line. Okay. And an example of the schematic which goes on with the fall line. Notice, of course, they could not get any further up unless they were on the coastal plain, and that's where they would build their cities. Gives you a little idea of the rugged, well, the indented coastline of the East Coast. Lots of indents here. I'm going to move right away to a place in Florida. It's called the Emerald Coast. The Emerald Coast is, well, as you can see, all the way from Pensacola to Panama City Beach. And this, I want to just mention this because it's kind of interesting, I think, and maybe some of you may even want to comment on it. Notice that this is pretty white sand. Well, there's a reason for that. When the first time I went to the Emerald Coast, I wondered whether I was still in Michigan, because was this snow or was this really Florida? And, well, it is white sand made from quartz. The quartz, rather interestingly, had to come down from the crystalline mountains up there that near the Tennessee border and the Kentucky border, which I'll show you in a moment. And that quartz came down that river and eventually wound up in the Gulf. So here you have this quartz sand, which is really white. And it is white because it is really quite pure at this point. As you can see, quartz, if it's pure quartz, it's just clear. If it's not, well, it's maybe quartz sand, quartzite, which is the kind of sand that you would wind up with here on Lake Michigan. So there's a difference between those two. At any rate, the quartzite, the quartz here is beautifully white. It arrives, or it gets broken up into really perfect ovals, and it's very small, eventually smaller than this one picture up here. But if you walk on this sand, and that happens on other sand too, but if you walk on your bare feet on it, the sand squeaks. You can hear it. It's just beautiful and smooth. So that's where that is along the beach. Well, here I have this picture again. This crystalline Appalachians way up in this area. You notice that we're not too far from, well, even Pennsylvania a little bit, but really in the areas more like, the edges of Kentucky and Tennessee and so forth. Well, that quartz that was in that area eventually eroded away and was carried down the Apalachicola River all the way down to the Gulf. And so as a consequence, when this quartz arrived at the Gulf here, the Gulf, its water itself kept churning it against the beach and further broke it apart and made it into very fine sand. It's only 20,000 years ago. Okay. Okay. By the way, if there's any comment, you go right ahead. And I'm quite sure, I'm not sure whether it's Bruce or whether it's Kim will butt in, and I hope they do. And go ahead and ask your question or make your comment, if you will. Actually, most ocean beach is sand of calcium carbonate, which is from coral or shellfish. So it doesn't have that whiteness on the other side of Florida, eastern on that coast. So, okay, where are these rivers that I'm talking about? Well, we got to go way back. The ice flowed against the parts of North America here. We're talking about 14,000 years ago. Notice that it produced a couple of lakes here at the edge. This one, are we hearing Mary's pad or something like that? Okay, maybe she wants to mute. Notice that this is Lake Chicago. Here is Lake Maumee. And we'll notice that they changed their name pretty soon. It recedes a little bit. And we have Lake Algonquin, which we obviously see is also Lake Michigan eventually. Lake Erie becomes evident, and so does Lake Ontario. 7,000 years ago, it is even further back. And for some reason or other, the geologists decided to change the name from Lake Chicago here or into Lake Chippewa. Okay, so we've got Lake Chippewa in this area and Lake Stanley instead of Huron. Keep on going, and we find all the lakes are clear of ice at 4,000 years ago. Now we go back here and see a couple of other situations. There were 4 advances of the glacier. And what was unique about it, of course, you see how far down it goes. What was unique about it, it missed a certain section and was known now as the Driftless Area. Here's a better picture of it in Wisconsin. That Driftless Area was not hit by any of the 4 advances. Here's another picture showing where the Driftless Area is. It's in this area. And then we want to look at the number of advances being made. The first advance and left a series of hills or moraines was the Nebraskan. And notice that the Nebraskan is now really obliterated because the Kansas one came, that era came through, and notice that it obliterated the Nebraskan. But you see it over here, it is quite evident on the lay of the land today. Here, the Kansas one was obliterated too. Then we get back to the Illinois one, and it kind of matches the Wisconsin one at this point. But all of them, notice all of them missed this driftless area. Now, that is significant as to where some of these rivers now are going to appear. So if this line down here is somewhat close to where the Ohio River is, we'll see that it is the drainage area for this particular space once the ice is gone. Okay, but we're not finished with this yet. Notice what it left. It left all these moraines. Hills is what they are. There's a spot right here around Chicago that leads on up to Grand Rapids and to us in Holland. And I'll mention that in just a moment. But while we're on this little one, notice here is the Ohio River, starting up here at Pittsburgh and winding up at KO. So we'll look at that in a little more detail in just a moment. But notice where this line is. Well, another picture of those end moraines around Chicago up into this area. Well, there's a name for it. It's called the Valparaiso Marine, around Chicago and up here toward us. In fact, it's close enough to us here to make itself known by Grand Rapids. this is Grand Rapids, this spot. And you will notice that Grand Rapids lies, and the Grand River goes through there, between the Valparaiso Marine and this one up there, the Charlotte Marine. So, and if you're in Grand Rapids, you notice those hills, one on one side of the river and one on the other side. Okay, that gives you a picture as to where that river probably is going to be. Okay, back to this one. 7,000 years ago, Lake Chippewa. Lake Chippewa. What's significant about it? Well, there's a kind of an interesting twist to that lake. It's, when it was Lake Chippewa, it was much smaller than Lake Michigan is, as you can see by this drawing. But there was a deeper area up in here and a deeper area below. Where, what happened to it? Most people have never heard of the Grand Haven River. And if I mention the Grand Haven River, oh no, you're wrong. That's the Grand Rapids River. Well, there is one if you want to go down inside the Lake Chippewa Lake, known as the Grand Haven River. That's one of your quiz questions, by the way. This is rather an interesting one, I think, because you see the makings of the Grand River. And the Grand River then dumped into the, well, what became Lake Michigan eventually. But at that point, it was called Lake Chicago because it was draining out through the Mississippi River. What's interesting, I think, is this area right here near Grand Valley State College, University. The dunes area where the university is built is right on the edge of this little drawing. And then the other dunes are going to be on the other side, leaving this space full of water for quite a while. And the wind whipped it back and forth enough to make that a very level area. So if you ever are in that area, Borculo is kind of in the center of it. West Olive and so forth are in that area too. That is a very level area. So due to the fact that it was a separate little lake for a little while in this era. Okay. Again, you see the same area that is still has water in it. But actually, in that same area, this Grand River, which really empties, of course, at Grand Haven, there was enough that went along the Chicago Drive, like in Hudsonville and so forth, and produced quite a swampy area, enough to make the muck very profitable for this growing of celery and all that kind of thing. That's in this area. Okay, notice that Lake Chicago is being emptied out into the west somewhere. And eventually it winds up in the Mississippi. And another area which I think is rather interesting for us in Michigan is Lake Maumee, the old Lake Maumee. And it is, well, the western end of it is where Fort Wayne is today. That is significant for Lake Maumee. Now let's go a little bit further here and notice that, oh, Fort Wayne is over here. The Marine is traveling in this, is pictured in this way, the Fort Wayne Marine, and there's a shorter one in Defiance Marine. But this is known as the Black Swamp. The Black Swamp was important to our history in Michigan. It had something to do with the fact that, well, we got the Upper Peninsula and Ohio got the Black Swamp during what is known as the Toledo War. It is being drained by the Maumee River, which goes, of course, into Lake Erie. Here's Fort Wayne again. All right, looking at it a little bit further, notice that the river starts here at Fort Wayne, behind that moraine, and all the other little rivers go along with it. But it was known as the Great Black Swamp, and that is pictured in this one over here. It was probably 25 miles by 100 miles long, that particular black swamp. Another river that's nearby, we'll mention, is the Wabash, which is quite well known too. That's over in Ohio. Well, this is all in Ohio. Notice now, there was a problem in this black swamp. During the Toledo War, wheeled vehicles could not get through this black swamp. And for that reason, the militia of Ohio, which wanted this area to be, wanted to get up into Michigan and claim part of Michigan, eventually decided it was not worth it, and decided, okay, let's just go ahead and trade it for the upper peninsula out of the Northwest Territory. It was agreed to be part of Michigan, and the swamp was given to Ohio. Well, that once you drain the swamp, it was tiled and very rich farmland it is today. And as you can see, this is it's level, it grows beautiful crops. Quite a few of the farmsteads were settled by Germans for a while, and I'm not sure whether that lasted into today, that they're still owned by German families, but they certainly did know how to build the land up and make it profitable. Okay, let's switch. I'm showing you this because the Northwest Territory is rather important at this time. You go into these states, they were not states yet at that point, but I'm showing you the total area of the Northwest Territory at that time. Well, there was a problem. Here we have Thomas Jefferson coming in. He's the president. He says, we got to do something with that Northwest Territory. And many of you will remember this, I'm sure. He wanted free navigation to the Mississippi River for the farmers along the Ohio River. Okay, so we better go ahead and make sure that we have enough land for that. And he made that Louisiana Purchase at that particular time. And he passed the Northwest Ordinance, and that is quite significant to us today. A quick picture of the Louisiana Purchase, and we're still not finished with the rivers out here in the east, but at least you get an idea that we're into the Lewis and Clark River travel of the Missouri River. Okay, back to the Northwest Ordinance. The Land Act made an orderly system of land management. Surveying started at the Ohio River. Townships and ranges were established. If you look at your own deed, if you live here in Michigan, in this area, you will have something referring you to townships and ranges. There was a survey divide the frontier into public territory for sale. The land was divided into townships. Each township was divided into 36 sections of 640 acres each. That's very evident on our landscape today. The Land Ordinance of 1785 continues here with one section was set aside for public education. And many of you may still remember the little country school that was in your particular area, established by this particular ordinance. 4 sections were set aside for the Revolutionary War veterans. Okay. The remaining were sold to settle the war debt. Now, here are those lines. The Michigan Meridian is one of them, but you need 2 areas in order to establish some kind of a grid. And so you have to have a baseline. And if you are in Michigan, you will find things known as baseline lake and baseline titles to certain things. The intersection of the Michigan Meridian and baseline is just south of Lansing, maybe about 40 miles or so. So that's where that started. But notice that, hey, there's another meridian over here in Wisconsin. It's the 4th meridian. So we'll see how far that goes. Look at all the meridian markers in the United States. The meridians and baselines are all through the area. Notice also that there aren't any in the eastern area. These were all measured already and had titles made in their deeds and the like. But the places that they would use in order to anchor and start their particular measurement might be a big rock, or on occasion even a tree that was old. But of course, the rocks could be moved and the trees maybe died, but then they established other areas for their measurement that were their focal points. But notice that these are meridians all the way across the United States and many of their own baselines. Just a quickie here. This is what a township and range. If you're located in any one of these, well, then you will have let's say it's this one right here. This would be range east, range 1 east. And if you were your township would be township 1 north. Oops, didn't want to do that. So on your deed, possibly your deed will have some kind of a township and range mentioned in there somewhere. Well, each one of these was divided into 36 sections. Notice that. And 36 townships. And notice that they're numbered this 1 through 6 this way and 7 back and forth. Well, if you take one of these, let's look at it, you will have it divided into sections. These sections are, well, acres of land. You will have the northwest 1/4 and the northeast 1/4. And in fact, you will hear people talk about the back 80 or the front 40 or whatever of their farmland. Still kind of using that same thing today. Well, we're still very much into this glacier business. Notice there's a line here of the drift area. We've been looking at that before, but it is very important to the making of the Ohio River. If we take a look at the glacier once more, this whole area did get like glaciation, but in the process, there was a river at that one time known as the Teays River, and they just pushed it out of there. They pushed it down the water out of there and made the Ohio River. Now, where's the Ohio River? Here's Pittsburgh up here. The Ohio River runs down in this direction, down until you hit the Mississippi River. I'll look at it again. Notice there's a river that comes from the north to this point and one from the south. And some of you maybe recognize it right away. as the start of the Ohio River. I'll go back to that in just a bit. But notice where the Ohio River is a part of the Missouri or the Mississippi River. So just a quick picture of that, and I'll go back to the Ohio River. Mississippi River, by the way, drains 40% of the America. Now, let's go back to a place called St. Louis in just a moment. There was a great flood in 1927. There's two that I will mention, but there were other sizable floods, but not quite as great as the one in 1927. And if you look at this river once more, and you saw the picture at the beginning of the presentation, it is loaded, or it is carrying an awful lot of water. As you can see, it's 40% of the United States. Way back in 1927, many of you remember the story of Charles Lindbergh. He did his famous flight and landed in Paris. Well, he got to St. Louis area from California with his plane, and he obviously could not get across unless he flew across the river. And so somebody made a nice little picture of this, which I picked up. And supposedly he's in this Spirit of St. Louis flying to New York, where he will take off and go to and wind up in Paris, in the Paris airport. Okay. 66 years later of the Great Flood, 1993. That's not too long ago, was another great flood that really took in St. Louis again. Obviously, you recognize the St. Louis Arch. Okay. Back to all of our different rivers. We got to catch up on a few here. One happens to be the Ohio. Pittsburgh. Okay. All the way down to KO. By the way, the R is not pronounced by the locals, so it's KO. Pittsburgh. And Louisville? No, that's called Louisville. Louisville, if you're really a good Kentuckian. Let's go back to Pittsburgh. Oh, the Allegheny and Ohio River joins the Monongahela joins the Ohio at this point. All right. What famous landmark is located at the confluence here? Anybody want to chime in on that?
Three River Stadium.
Aha, we got the Three River Stadium, yes. Well, notice here, the Allegheny comes from the north and the Monongahela from the south at Pittsburgh. Okay, and on down. Now notice this picture here does show it partly as the two join each other into one. And oh, well, you're right. Three River Stadium was demolished in 2000. The Steelers moved it away into Heinz Field. So no longer do we have a Three River Stadium, but it was pretty famous. Once again, take a look at the traveling here of the Ohio. Cincinnati is a part of it, and Louisville and Paducah, and all on that river. Rather interesting river. How would you like to take a barge trip on it? It looks like the facilities are pretty good. Not only the barge trip, but also the trip on the what are these? The big stern wheelers. Notice the traveling on the Ohio is rather, well, crowded quite often because they use it a lot for their barges. This little tug is pushing that barge along. But here's a very nice steamboat. I imagine you can get reservations on that one too. Now, okay, we keep going back to that glacier business. Numerous moraines. Okay, there are some terms here we might want to look at. There's something called glacial till, and in the glacial till is what the glacier spread along with it, and making some kettles, which are now lakes. I'll show you that in a moment. And there's various layers to it, and not only layers that the glaciers left, but loish, which the wind blew in. So you got all that kind of thing in the Midwest. Many layers under the surface, including limestone, shale, dolomite, sandstone, and coal. Lots of coal was mined in the Illinois area for years. I put down here rivers with falls. There's a lot of rivers that short rivers that still have the falls, and I'll show you that in a moment. Look at all these falls in Ohio and Indiana. They're all over the place. The Wabash covers a big area in Indiana, and some of you probably have visited the falls in this area because they are used as parks and places for recreation. I just picked one of them. This happens to be the McCormick Creek Fall, and that's what it looks like. It has no particular significance other than I just picked one. And Cliffy Falls over here, I picked that one too, just to show you that there are falls in this area of Indiana. Okay, just a quick little lesson on the geology of the area. When the ice sheet comes along here and recedes, when it recedes, it leaves a moraine. Okay, we've been talking about that. Maybe one way out here, and then it recedes a little bit more and leaves another moraine. In the process, underneath the sheet, it also leaves certain hills. These are drumlin hills. If you want to see a bunch of drumlin hills, you can travel in upper New York from Buffalo to Albany, and you will be traveling actually through and even amongst the drumlins that are there. There's little low hills that look like inverted spoons. Also underneath the glacier, you will find areas where they lost a few ice blocks. And these ice blocks settled into the area and was then covered by this glacial till. And eventually they show up as lakes. Also, a little river probably is also running underneath, besides this one here. And it will then leave lots of material, mostly gravel, and it'll be like a snake on the surface. It's called an esker. And if you travel like up into Charlevoix and up and toward Petoskey, you'll probably be riding on one of those eskers away for a while. Okay. Just a quick little picture on how they are formed. You've got, let's say, the block of ice then gets covered by sediment and then melts, and you get a lake. Same diagram down here, same kind of picture. And then you have what's the kettle hole. And the kettle hole, by the way, if you want to see one, you can go down to Gun Lake Park system. There's a dry one up in the hills at Gun Lake. Looks like a miniature football stadium. I know looking down into it, the tops of the trees is what you saw, but they were growing in the bottom of the kettle. flat Indiana farmland. Okay, well, the Ohio, what happens to it? It meets the Mississippi River at Keokuk, Illinois. The picture here is supposed to be, anyway, the Ohio is coming down through here and the Mississippi at this point, and they join. Again, you see a little bit better picture of the confluence of the two. Okay. We're seeing evidence of something called levees. We'll look at levees in just a little bit too. Keep on going. We'll take in another river for a little bit. Go ahead.
Before we get too far from the Midwest, in earlier diagrams, you showed Lake Michigan draining to the Mississippi. As we know, it didn't used to do that until they did some engineering in Chicago. And of course, Chicago's proximity gave it a wonderful position. So could you tell us a little bit more about that area and, of course, the influence it's had on us?
Well, yes, the Illinois River did run into Lake Michigan for quite a long time until Chicago dumped so much of their trash into the Illinois River that it wound up in Lake Michigan, and that was not desirable, obviously. So they reversed the course of the Illinois River and made it go down now toward the Mississippi. And I imagine they're getting the trash or whatever they keep on dumping into the river. I'm not sure whether that's a clean river or not. But yeah, the Illinois River eventually, well, there's the Fox River that goes along with it too, eventually winding up in the Mississippi. So I don't know whether it answers but your comments are very well appreciated, that we stop and talk about that a little bit. Thank you, Bruce.
Yeah, my thought was that the strategic location of Chicago being so close to waters that go to the Mississippi, as well as waters that go to the St. Lawrence, is clearly an accident of glaciation, and that just seemed an example you might want to touch on, but I leave it to you.
Yeah, okay. And we did not talk about the St. Lawrence River, which also is very important to the Great Lakes, partly because I have that in another presentation of the Great Lakes.
Okay, all right.
But that's all right. Thank you for pointing that out. Anybody else want to comment on those? I show you this picture of the Tennessee River. Notice that they were having all kinds of problems with floods and the like. Look at the dams that they put in. Not only did they control some of the flooding that was going on, but also produced some power resources and water resources for various towns in the area. But what a number of dams on that river. Again, shows you some of the dams that control the flooding that was happening in that particular area. So the government took over and helped make some dams. Tennessee Valley Authority. Okay. I show you this because I'm going to use parts of it here. We've already talked about the Ohio and the Tennessee. Now, another biggie is, of course, the Missouri. So the Mississippi winds up in New Orleans. New Orleans, not if you are a resident of the city, it's New Orleans, okay? But notice how it bends and turns and twists around. Oh, We got a problem with that. Here is a picture of, well, the colored part here is below sea level. And if it's going to be below sea level, you better have some levees. And that's exactly what they have. And if a levee breaks, they're in big trouble. So you have levees along Lake Pontchartrain up here and also along the river down here. Picture of that is here. Notice that the levee at this point has got to be at least about 18 feet high in order to keep the Mississippi River out of it when it's high. And Lake Pontchartrain, it's at least, well, at least 11 feet high in order to keep the Lake Pontchartrain out of the city of New Orleans. Some of these are famous streets. St. Anthony is a famous street, and also Canal Street. So you get a little idea that they've got a problem if they don't have a levee that's up. Here's the Superdome, is now known as the Mercedes-Benz Superdome, since Mercedes decided they would contribute the money for it. That's their Superdome. Was a place of refuge for many people during floods. Any of the floods, they wind up in the Superdome. And that's located here in New Orleans. All right. Just a couple of remarks on this one. The Mississippi River changed its courses enough, but it wound up here in the present form. Notice how it splits out into a number of distributaries, but it changed itself over the years as to exactly where it dumped into the Gulf of Mexico. Another look at that is how that Mississippi River, which is this one, this is the present one, the green one, that winds up into the Gulf. But over the years, it has changed its course a number of times. And there's another one, the Appalachia also is going in a similar place. Once again, you see where it spreads out into distributaries like this. And as it does, it deposits sediment, more and more, sediment, more and more. Okay, and it looks like, in geological terms, like this is supposed to be a bird's foot delta. And I imagine that's why you could see why they would call it that. That is in reference to a separate delta, which the Nile has, which is the Cuspate Delta, where the Mediterranean keeps working at it, so it does not go into, well, it levels it all off before it makes its way into the Mediterranean. All right, I'll zip through some of this, but I think you can see it in a quick order. This is what happens to a river often. It may be at this level, the top level, and then it may cut down and it be at the second level. And then finally, it may cut some more and be at the present level. And when it's cutting down, it makes, well, turns and twists, leaving scars. All right. Here's one area where it left a bunch of scars. It was turning in this area for a while, and then this one, and receded on up, so they leave these scars. Sometimes it goes all the way into this turn here into this meander, and then gets cut off. And then you've got an Oxbow Lake. By the way, if you want to see an Oxbow Lake, the Oxbow in Saugatuck is at least a version of that. The river is busy all the time. It's cutting on one side and depositing on the other side. And then not only does it do that, it builds levee. And it builds a levee along the side so it will not let rivers from the outside come on in, like this Yazoo stream. This Yazoo stream, which comes out of Memphis, just can't make it until it goes way downstream before it meets the Mississippi. The building of a levee, if the river is like this one, it contained in its banks, then there's a flood. So the sediments, the heavier sediments, drop out at the edge because swift water is in the middle and it's kind of slow water on the outside, leaving them to build a levee. And it just keeps on building until you get a sizable levee. And the next thing you know, the river is above the outside. And that happens all the time. Okay, Mississippi is really guilty of a lot of that. Noticing that you do have the scars, various places along the rivers. The natural levee here is being built on this particular one. All right, a quickie here. Notice the river might be going normally and pretty soon it twists and turns and it builds on both sides and eventually cuts that off. Now, I got a pretty good picture of that in reality. The buildup and the erosion that just constantly occurs along the banks. Oh, I don't want people to think that this is Freedom Village. But at a certain age, you just don't care what people think anymore. This guy's even got a whip. Quiz time. Your first quiz. I will go through that quickly with you so that if you can't read this, here are the answers. All right. I presume, I'm hoping that you've already got your quiz filled out. If you haven't, well, go ahead and put in the right answers. So number one is J as in jig. Number two is love, L. Number three is Roger. Number four is Abel. Number five is King. Number six is Baker. Number seven is Oboe. Number eight is Charlie. Number nine is Sugar. Number 10 is Dog. Number 11 is Nan. Number 12 is Peter. Number 13 is Fox. Number 14 is Mike. Number 15 is George. And every one of you got them all right, and therefore you all get 100%. Right? We're moving on. This meander is quite significant for a place called New Madrid. Let's look at that a moment. That meander is enough to cause a split in the states of Missouri and Kentucky. So you have to cross the river or go through Tennessee in order to get to the rest of Kentucky if you are in Kentucky. Oh, yeah. Well, that's not the main thing I'm going to show you anyway, but it's kind of interesting to see that. The New Madrid earthquake in 1811-12, it was the largest in U.S. history, okay? Rattled doors in Washington, D.C. The legend says it woke President James Madison in the White House. By the way, why am I picking up this earthquake now in relation to rivers? Well, it has quite a bit to do with the Mississippi. So let's talk about that. It rang the church bells in Boston and Charleston, South Carolina. It created, Reelfoot Lake. Maybe some of you have fished in Reelfoot Lake. By the way, during the earthquake, church membership jumped 50%. It's centered here in New Madrid, and you get a little idea with the rings here how far it went out. Now, here's Detroit up here, Holland is up here. Okay. But went all the way to the Washington, D.C. This little lake right in here is next to this zone. This is the earthquake zone. This little area here was a depression, or it became a depression during that earthquake. And then with that depression, it filled up with water. So it's still right in this area along the Mississippi River. Here happens to be the fault line where the earthquake occurred, one of them anyway, and a small one on the edge in Kansas. Now, as you can see, it pushed itself right on up with the fault in the Memphis area and New Madrid, right in this area. And of course, here you find the, the Reelfoot Lake. This is what it looks like in a small fashion. It is now covered with water. The land was subsided, and during that earthquake, the Mississippi ran backward during the earthquake, covering the forest in that area of that depression and created the Reelfoot Lake. So right in there. Just a picture of St. Louis as we get ready to go up the Missouri River. Here we go. St. Louis, and well, let's go first from Minneapolis, St. Paul to St. Louis, and then later on we'll pick up, well, we already did pick up the area of New Orleans, so let's go up here first to Minneapolis. Once again, the riverboat and the traffic on the Mississippi is great. And some of you may have been on the trip that the HASP took that started near Davenport and went up to Dubuque on the Mississippi. That HASP trip was rather enjoyable. Okay. I show you this particular highway because it was in the news not that long ago. Highway 35 West, crossed the Mississippi here in Minneapolis. The building collapsed. Let's see here, I got the date here pretty soon. This bridge collapsed. I thought I had the date here, 2008, I believe it was. Yeah, here we go. August 2007, that particular bridge collapsed into the Mississippi River. At that particular time, that was after I had left Minnesota with the when I was at the University of Minnesota. In fact, I crossed the Mississippi a number of times on the U of M bridge. This is what it looks like. I probably crossed it 3 times a week because I had classes on one side and on the other, on both banks of the Mississippi of the Minneapolis campus. Back to New Orleans. Or no, St. Louis, I'm sorry. Up the Missouri River. We're traveling on this river now, and we should be leaving the area along with Lewis and Clark. So up the river. The muddy Missouri meets the Mississippi, and it is truly muddy. Once again, I show you this because the Missouri River tends to have followed the glacier edge out here. Otherwise, we move right on. From the St. Louis entrance, we come up here into just beyond Three Forks, where we find it is split in this area, and I'll show you something more on that in just a moment. But you get a little idea of this river going up through the Dakotas into Montana, and then eventually winding up at St. Louis. Again, seeing the same river with a number of other rivers joining it, including the North Platte right here through Nebraska. The Platte River enters Missouri at this point. Notice that, let's see, the Platte River is a nice place for the sandhill cranes to congregate, at least for part of the year. They will come through and really blanket the area with their flocks of cranes along the Platte River mostly. And as you can see, it really gets to be thick with birds when they're around. Platte River. Sandhill crane gives you a quick look at one, what they look like. All right. Irrigation is the big thing out of the Platte River, except they run out of water. But it's beautiful vegetation that it can produce, and ranches and the like. But there's a problem. You gotta have enough water. So underneath that whole area, including the Platte, and I'll show you a map on that too, is something known as the Ogallala Aquifer. And it is a source of much water for the ranchers and the people here in the area that grow crops and the like. Notice that it has to come out of the mountainous areas of the Rockies. And whatever comes out of there tends to then be absorbed into the lower layers. What runs off on the Platte River runs off, obviously, but there's enough that does recharge this particular river, or this aquifer, excuse me. Here's the location of that aquifer. It's the underground area. And a little idea as to what's already happening. A little bit will rise during the year at the Platte River, but down under, this is all underneath, the area that is blue is losing from 10 to minus 10 feet per year, all that blue. And then you get over into the yellow, and then it is really losing a lot more, 10 to 50 feet. And eventually you get to this decline is more than 50 feet here. So there's a real problem of recharge on this particular thing. Irrigation is a result. Nice pies. Showing you the extent of the Ogallala Aquifer, it does stretch from South Dakota all the way to Texas, but they keep using it and it goes down. Now, Omaha is on the Missouri River. Let's find out where that is. On Missouri River, there is a natural wildlife center called the DeSoto. It is located just north of the Omaha city. All right. In that particular DeSoto place, it is part of an abandoned meander. And this meander is still there. It's a full lake yet at this point. However, it was cut off not too long ago, and steamships kept plying this whole river area, okay, around the bend before it was cut off. Well, there's a certain ship that didn't make it. Lots of them didn't make it, but this particular one is known as the Bertrand. The Bertrand, it was located right at this particular, it sank into the river during a storm. Well, in that particular area, if you go to the museum or visitor center, it is loaded with observation places where you will see the snow geese. Lots of them at certain times of the year. Well, the steamboat traffic between St. Louis and Fort Benton, Montana, 400 steamboats sank in this part of the Missouri River. We just have one of them. The Bertrand was buried in 30 feet of mud in 1865. I mean, it just swamped it right over so that it was preserved. 200,000 artifacts are on display in the museum here in DeSoto. This particular steamboat, I imagine is an artist picture of it. The model is in the museum, but it went down. This is the model of the museum, of the Bertrand. Well, they found out that there was some people that found out that there was something below, and they located the Bertrand, which was under all this mud. And they started digging and keeping the water from the area with their various dams and the like. And they dug it up. In the process of digging it up, they found pieces that were the cargo. The cargo was there, and this is some of it. You could see bottles and cans and the like here, but this is a little bit better picture of that, and all kinds of different bottles of particularly alcohol and whiskey and the like that they sent on as anything that the people over there in the gold country needed. They put into this, they carried into this. And of course, here you got a big piece of plow for people up there. Okay, into the ship itself, you will see that they finally kept the water away enough so that they could get into it, and they started to take out these parts. I showed you a few of them. Here's one that was broken, and they had to make it new. Here are some of the tools that they found in that same condition to be taken up to the coal mines or gold mines. Some of these really stayed intact. They were able to rescue them in that way. What do you have here? You have yeast cans, snops, bitters, all found in that particular one. And just a general picture of all the bottles and glass that they were able to pick up. They were headed for Alder Gulch. Where's Alder Gulch? Well, 30 million in gold was extracted here at Alder Gulch between 1863 and 1866. Well, before you get there, we have to leave Bertrand and Iowa and Missouri. There's something known as the Loish Hills. Loish is really wind deposit sand, but they really gathered in this particular area of Iowa. And so these are the Loish Hills. And if you pronounce it correctly like a German would, because it's a German word, it's Loish. That was located along here, and you can travel that particular highway next to it. Where did it start? Well, way up here, Great Falls up here, Montana. But before that, it started with three little rivers known as the Jefferson, the Gallatin, and the Madison. And here is another picture of those three rivers forming the Missouri. That's where it started. Well, two guys were sent over there by Thomas Jefferson. He says, now explore that Louisiana Purchase. And so that's what they were doing, Lewis and Clark. Up the Missouri. They made it through the Big Bend. More recently, the Big Bend has now been used as a reservoir and as a power plant place for water and the like. And that is shown just in this area here, the Big Bend in South Dakota. Okay, here's the electric power dam at Big Bend. So it's a source of water for those people in the Dakota area. A quick here, moving on with the Lewis and Clark. They wound up here in Bismarck and zipped on over to the Pacific eventually, but we're interested just in this part here. And we get to a place called Lake Sakakawea. Well, that has a particular name because Lewis and Clark met this lovely girl who was well, at least she knew how to tell the people where the Shoshone were and to be careful about them and the like, treat them nice and all that. And evidently, she talked to the Shoshone when they were there and kept them from, hurting Lewis and Clark and the like. But in order to honor her, they named a lake after her. It's spelled a little different than her name. Lake Sakakawea is the lake that is located there. And she told them, she says, you will see a very loud noise of huge waterfalls, of course, great falls. And they got themselves all the way over to the Pacific Ocean. All right. Okay. By the way, here we have some glacial lakes. That all comes into play at next week's talk about the Columbia River and the like. Okay. Now, if you can figure this one out, this building here had an ophthalmologist. This one had a dentist. This one had a podiatrist. And then this guy's putting up a sign. And these people here are saying, I have to admit, I'm a little anxious to see what's going to be hanging from that sign. What would you guess? Proctologist. Are you ready for your quiz? It's your second quiz. I'll run through it quickly so that you know what it is. Once again, number 1 is dog. Number 2 is fox. Number 3 is love. Number 4 is George. Number 5 is oboe. Number 6 is Nan. Number 7 is king. Number 8 is Abel. Number 9 is easy. Number 10 is Baker. Number 11 is how. Number 12 is Charlie. Number 13 is Mike. Number 14 is Jig. All right. That really concludes it. I don't know if there are any questions or comments you want to make at this point, but
Jerry, I did get a question in the chat. This is Kim.
Go ahead.
It just says, Jerry, did I miss why the bottomlands are on the east side of Illinois and Mississippi exist? I lived in Peru, Illinois, and the bottomlands flood in early spring and then were planted in May in very rich farmland.
Oh, I do not know the answer to that. Maybe somebody else knows the answer to it. The bottomland must have then been freed with, I'm speculating now, with a levee so it does not flood, so that they can go ahead and raise crops there.
Okay, that's all I had.
All right. Okay. Anybody else want to chime in? Okay. Well, thank you for.
I have one question. You talked about baselines, and baseline through east to west Michigan is 8 Mile Road in Detroit, isn't it?
That's correct. You're right.
And sometimes in Detroit they call it baseline.
Yes, you're right. Yes. Let's see.
Big road in Detroit, 8 Mile.
Who wrote the song about that? There was a song about the baseline in Detroit, and I've forgotten it was.
There was a movie about 8 Mile Road.
Yeah, maybe that was it. Okay. Yeah, thank you for contributing that. That's great. Anything else? Well, I appreciate your listening, and I think that's it, Kim.
Great. Thank you so much, Jerry. We'll see you all next week.
Next week.
Great job as always, Jerry.
Well, thank you. That was Jim.
Yes, thank you, Jerry.
All right.
Thank